Do you want to play the most broken mechanic ever printed? Do you like vampires? Well, this powerhouse is getting a reprint. Edgar Markov. He got his first print 8 years ago and has been a dominant force in the commander scene ever since. He's a vampire tribal commander, which uses the mechanic Eminence. In our opinion, Eminence is one of the most broken mechanics Wizards has ever printed. Eminence basically gives value from the command zone without even ever having to cast your commander. With Innistrad Remastered on the horizon, he's getting a reprint, and a beautiful one at that. Look at the movie poster. We got a couple of boxes of Innistrad Remastered, and we're really hoping to pull a serialized Edgar. Preferably number 1. So Edgar is a 6-drop in black, white, and red. He's a 4/4 with first strike and haste, and whenever he attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on all of your vampires, which is solid in itself, but his true power lies in his Eminence ability. Whenever you cast a vampire spell, if Edgar is in the command zone or on the battlefield, you get to create a 1/1 black vampire token, which can be really powerful early on in the game when you just cast your vampires and you get a whole board filled of vampires. Basically for free. He's a real value engine by himself and you don't even need to cast him. Main strengths of this deck are A, going wide, casting vampires and creating a board full of vampire tokens, which you can buff with lords and just swing for combat damage. Second strategy is draining your opponents, so basically making them lose life while you gain life, killing the entire table at once. We also play a couple of infinite combos, which will instantly win you the game. So we'll be going over every single card in the deck. I divided them up in 5 categories. The creatures, the interaction spells, support spells, regular lands, and the utility lands. Let's start with the most important part, the creatures. So as you could have guessed, we're playing a lot of vampires. Starting off, we have a 1-drop Falcon Red Pit Fighter. She's an awesome 1-drop, which is vampire, which will generate a token with Edgar, and she generates a lot of card advantage. She requires you to sacrifice a vampire creature. You will have a lot of those around anyways because of Edgar. Very solid value. Another 1-drop we play is Indulgent Vampire. He's a solid 1/1 lifelink vampire, and for 2 mana we get to sacrifice a creature and put a 1/1 counter on all creatures we control. This is really solid when we go white with our vampire tokens. A very underrated card is a common from Gatecrash, Shadow Alley Denizen. So whenever a black creature enters the battlefield under our control, we get to grant one of our creatures Intimidate, which is perfect for evasion and getting little bits of damage in. We'll be having a lot of black creatures entering the battlefield anyways whenever we cast a vampire because of Edgar. All-time classic card many black decks play is Blood Artist. Whenever any creature dies, even the ones your opponents control, we get to gain 1 life and make target player lose 1 life. We play a lot of drain cards like this in the deck to drain out our opponents. So even when you have a board full of vampires and they all die, we get to get a lot of value from the draining effect. Another really similar card we play is Vengeful Blood Witch. It's basically Blood Artist, a little bit worse, since it only triggers when one of our creatures die. Still, very solid addition to the deck. Charismatic Conqueror. One of the more awesome 2-drop vampires there is ever been printed. He really slows down opponents or generates value for us. So when an opponent plays an artifact or a creature, they can choose, or they decide to have it enter tapped, or we get a 1/1 vampire, which grants us a really wide board state. Really solid card and will slow down opponents. One of my personal favorite cards in the deck is Cordial Vampire. He's a 2-drop, and whenever a creature you control dies, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. This really adds up with Edgar and all the tokens you will have in play to build a really solid board to swing with at opponents. Cruel Celebrant. Really similar to Blood Artist and Vengeful Blood Witch, whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and we gain 1 life. Another drain effect, perfect vampire for the deck. A card that wouldn't be good under normal circumstances is Dusk Legion Zealot. So when he enters the battlefield, we get to draw 1 card and lose 1 life. Thanks to Edgar, this guy replaces himself and gives us a free vampire token basically. The first non-vampire creature in the deck, Elas Ilkor, and I'll tell you why we play him. He's one of the better 2-drop drain engines that exist in Magic. He's a 2/2 Death Touch body, which is really solid in itself. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, we gain 1 life. And whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. This is the best drain card we have in the deck. Sadly, it's not a vampire, but hey, we still play it. As mentioned before, this deck will go really wide, so we also play Vampire Lords. A Lord basically is a card that gives every type of creature +1/+1 or some beneficial effect. Legion Lieutenant just gives all your vampires +1/+1, and it's a vampire itself. Solid. Null Priest of Oblivion, a vampire with Kicker. If we cast it for 2 mana, it's solid, it's just a vampire body which will generate a token. If we do have 6 mana later on in the game, we can kick it and we get to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield, which can change the outcome of a game in some cases. Just a solid hybrid card you can play early to get tokens or later in the game to get a beneficial effect. In my opinion, the strongest 2-drop vampire in the deck. Oathsworn Vampire. He's a really simple card. He's a 2-drop 2/2 vampire that enters tapped, which is not that great, but if we gain life, which we will do obviously with all the drain effects we play, we get the ability to recast him from our graveyard, which will generate another vampire with Edgar. Solid card. Really good recursion value. Olivia's Bloodsworn, another awesome 2-drop, which has evasion by itself, so it's easy to connect with. For 1 red mana, we can give any vampire haste, which really turns up the pressure for opponents. Nothing is better than late in the game when you drop a big vampire and you can swing immediately with it. How can we play a Drain deck without Extort cards? Tithe Drinker. It's a 2-drop vampire with the Extort mechanic. Basically, whenever we get to cast a spell, we can pay 1 white or black mana and each opponent will lose 1 life and we will gain 1 life. Perfect fit for the deck. Really underrated card. Said before, we will generate a lot of vampire tokens, which we can utilize to sacrifice them to cards like Vampire Gurmo. Whenever he attacks, we get to sacrifice a creature and get to draw a card. Perfect card advantage. Your hand will be running empty really fast in this deck because you will be filling the board early in the game, so we need cards like this. Next card is a Lord, but not really. It's a 2/2 vampire with Menace, which is solid. When she enters the battlefield, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on every vampire we control if an opponent lost life this turn, which will not be hard to do in an aggregate deck. When an opponent lost life this turn and she is on the battlefield, every other vampire will also enter with a +1/+1 counter on it. Solid. Solid 2-drop from Phyrexia is Vraan. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 2 life and you get to gain 2 life. This ability only triggers once per turn, but if he sticks on the battlefield, this effect really adds up since it can also trigger on opponents' turns. Very good drain card. Don't sleep on this guy. Captivating Vampire is a 3-drop Vampire Lord. So he gives all our vampires +1/1, but he has another ability. If you tap 5 untapped vampires you control, you can gain control of any creature on the battlefield permanently. And it also becomes a vampire in addition to its other types, so we can interact with it. Generating 5 vampires in this deck is the easiest thing to do with Edgar in the command zone or on the battlefield, doesn't matter, and you get to steal creatures from everyone. Awesome. Clavileño. Whenever you attack, 1 vampire gets another line of text. When it dies, you get a 4/3 Vampire Demon token and you get to draw a card. He seems strong on paper, but in testing, I didn't find him particularly interesting. So yeah, we'll see what happens. You can consider him, you can try him out for yourself, and yeah. Let us know in the comments if it works for you. One of our combo pieces in the deck is Marauding Blight Priest. Whenever we gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. As you've seen on the cards before, we'll be gaining a ton of life by draining opponents, and this combos with a lot of cards in the deck. I'll be talking about this later in the combo section of the video. Even when we're not running a combo, she will still do a lot of work by draining opponents. Markov Baron. So he gives all our vampires +1/1, and he has the Convoke mechanic, which allows you to tap creatures to pay for his mana cost. As you've noticed, it's really easy for us to get vampire tokens out with Edgar, which we can then tap to cast Markov Baron. A really solid card. He also has the Madness ability, but that's not really relevant. Yeah, I know, he doesn't look like a vampire, but he's a changeling, so he is a vampire. Megaganty is a changeling with an awesome ability, allowing you to pay X mana, which will result in the base power and toughness of your creatures being equal to X until the end of turn. Really strong when you have a board full of vampires and a lot of mana to spend, which is perfect for our Edgar deck. Creature of the Schism is another awesome Death Touch vampire, which will generate tokens for us or draw us cards. When you attack the player with the most life, you get to generate a 1/1 vampire token. When you attack with him, when you have the most life, which usually will be the case since we play a lot of drain effects, you get to draw a card. Very solid addition to the deck. We even have vampires in the Wild West. Ruthless Lawbringer is a card from Thunder Junction. Whenever he enters, we get to sacrifice a creature to destroy any non-land permanent. We will always have tokens to sacrifice generated by Edgar. Interaction on a stick. Wizards really printed a lot of Vampire Lords. Stormcur Captain. Awesome dude, gives all our vampires +1/1 and First Strike. The First Strike can be really relevant since we are a combat-based deck. Just recently printed in the Foundation Jumpstart set is Vito. He's also a combo piece we use. Whenever we gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Very strong card in itself, will generate a ton of value on the battlefield. He also has the ability for 5 mana to give every creature lifelink, and when we go for a swing, we will gain a lot of life and deal a lot of damage. I've been looking at a lot of Edgar lists, and no one is playing this card, Voldaren Ambusher. Whenever it enters the battlefield, we get to deal X damage to a creature or a planeswalker equal to the amount of vampires we control. Baseline, this is very solid because Edgar triggers when we cast a vampire. So the vampire enters first, then this enters, and we get to deal 2 damage, minimum. Really strong inclusion to remove someone's commander. I think this is the first vampire we mentioned that actually has flying, Welcoming Vampire. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, we get to draw a card. Really awesome in this deck because we will generate tokens. Sadly, it only triggers once every turn, but we can also trigger it on opponents' turns. When you have lords on the battlefield, she can sometimes buff your tokens to 3/3 and she will not trigger. So that's something you will have to watch out for. A real beatstick creature in the deck is Yahenni. He's a vampire with haste, and whenever a creature your opponents control dies, he gets a +1/+1 counter. Awesome thing is, we can sacrifice a creature ourselves to grant them indestructible until the end of the turn. As mentioned before, we will have a lot of vampire fodder because of Edgar, which we can sacrifice to make him indestructible. Another value engine by himself is Dragon Bertram Greywater. Whenever we create a token, we get to create an additional vampire token on top of that. Only triggers once per turn. And for 2 mana, we get to sacrifice an artifact or a creature and get to draw a card. He's perfect for grindy games where you really need that card advantage. Another awesome creature everyone knows is Bloodlethic of Alkalots. Personally, I did not know it was a vampire. He says whenever an opponent loses life during your turn, they lose double that amount instead. Really awesome card. This guy will steal games out of nowhere. A classic vampire everyone knows is Bloodline Keeper. He's a flip card. You require 5 vampires to flip him and 1 black mana. Usually you can flip this the moment it hits the battlefield. Doesn't require haste because it's an activated ability. When he flips, he turns into a juiced up vampire lord, giving all your vampires +2/+2. And you can also tap him to generate another 2/2 flying vampire token. Really solid. When you play a deck that plays Drain, you have to play Sanctum Seeker. Whenever a vampire you control attack, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Really solid, really good synergy with the tokens we get from Edgar. Twilight Prophet is a card that interacts with the City's Blessing. You have the City's Blessing when you control 10 or more permanents, which is easy to do with the vampire tokens Edgar generates. When you do have the City's Blessing, you get to flip the top card of your library on every upkeep and get to put it in your hand. You also get to drain opponents equal to the mana cost of that card. Really strong card. I'm not that big of a fan, but we'll have to see how it performs. Another vampire that drains is Vindictive Vampire. Whenever a creature we control dies, each opponent loses 1 life, we gain 1 life. Your opponent plays a board wipe, for example, which they will have to do at some point to stay in the game. You get a lot of triggers and drain your opponents for a lot of life. This basically gives you semi-protection against board wipes. Another card used in many black commander decks is Yawgmoth Physician. I know he's not a vampire, but his value is too good to pass up on. Life is a resource, so with his ability, he allows us to pay 1 life and sacrifice a creature. We get to draw a card and put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Really solid value with the vampire tokens we control because of Edgar. He also has a second ability, which allows us to discard a card and proliferate. We can proliferate the -1/-1 counters he puts on target creatures, or proliferate the +1/+1 counters all our vampires will have because of Edgar attacking. The newest card in the deck is Bloodthirsty Conqueror, and what a card. He's an invaluable combo piece for any drain deck. So whenever an opponent loses life, we get to gain life. We'll explain why he's so good in the combo section later on in the video. Champion of Dusk is one of our curve toppers in the deck. Whenever he enters the battlefield, we get to lose X life equal to the vampires we control, and we also get to draw X cards equal to the vampires we control. Very solid to refill your hand later on in the game. Before we move on, the last creature in the deck, Malakar Bloodwitch. She has protection from white, she has flying, awesome body in itself. Whenever she enters the battlefield, each opponent loses life equal to the amount of vampires we control, and we gain that much life. Perfect to end some games with. Remember Edgar's ability to generate vampires? Yeah, exactly. Before we move on to the support cards, if you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot more of these coming up. Turn on the notification bell so you get reminded of the videos. Let's move on to the support cards. As you can imagine, our hand will be emptied really fast in this deck, since we'll be playing a lot of cheap vampires. So we play a lot of cheap draw spells to keep our hand filled in the early turns of the game. First up, Corrupted Conviction. 1 mana, we have to sacrifice a creature, but we get to draw 2 cards. Perfect with Edgar's vampire tokens. Perfect fodder to sacrifice. Exactly the same card as Village Rites. Same effect, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards. Since we ran out of 1 mana, sacrifice and draw 2 effects, we're also playing 2 mana effects. Deadly Dispute. We get to sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards, and create a treasure token. So basically as cheap as Village Rites. The last cheap draw spell we're playing is Plum the Forbidden. It's not meant for the early game. In comparison to the previous one, this one is meant for the late game. We get to sacrifice any number of creatures. The number of creatures we sacrifice equals the times we can copy this spell. Effect is really simple. We lose 1 life, draw 1 card. So later on in the game, when you have 5 vampires sitting around, sacrifice 5 vampires and get to draw 5 cards. Really good in grindy games. I know we went over the creatures already, but this creature feels more like a support card than an actual creature. Master of Dark Rites allows us to sacrifice a creature to generate 3 black mana, which we can only utilize to cast vampires. When you cast this on turn 1, you will also get the 1/1 vampire because of Edgar. On turn 2, you have 5 available mana to cast vampires. This also sets up for turn 3 Edgar on the board. Really crazy value, you must include this card in the deck. Reconnaissance allows us to remove our attack and creatures from combat at instant speed. So basically when we attack with Edgar, we can get his attack trigger, getting to put a +1/+1 counter on all of our vampires and then remove him from combat, so he doesn't get blocked and dies. We also have a lot of other cards that trigger on attack, and Reconnaissance helps keep them alive. As most of you know, Skullclamp is a really good card in itself, but especially in an Edgar deck. It's a deck where we generate free 1/1 tokens. We get to equip Skullclamp for 1 mana on one of our tokens we generate for free anyways, and we get to draw 2 cards. This gets out of hand really fast and your hand will always be filled when you have Skullclamp on the field. Unpopular opinion, I'm not a big fan of Sol Ring. It's a dead card in many decks in my opinion, but we just have to play it in this deck. Getting Edgar out early or getting to fill our board a turn earlier with vampires is really crazy, and it's still one of the most solid acceleration cards in the game. Since we play combos in this deck, we also play tutors. First up being the best one, Demonic Tutor. For 2 mana, we get to search for our deck for a card, put it in our hand. This is perfect to get the combo pieces we need at the time, or some crucial vampires we need at the time. Next card is Diabolic Intent. It's basically Demonic Tutor, but we have to sacrifice a creature in addition to its other costs. Not a problem in this deck since we can just sacrifice a vampire generated by Edgar. Another classic card every black deck plays is Black Market Connections. Generates card value, generates treasures, and it also generates a 3/2 Changeling, which is also a vampire. So this deck has extra benefit from Black Market Connections. In our opinion, Banner of Kinship is better than Coated Arms. Coated Arms is a classic card that buffs every creature every player controls of a selected creature type. Banner of Kinship only works for our creatures. I play a lot in a group with lots of tribal decks and Coat of Arms is just a no-go. So Banner of Kinship is the second best option. When you play it, it gets a counter for every creature of the selected creature type you control. As long as it stays on the battlefield, every creature gets boosted by the number of counters on Banner of Kinship. You can imagine this getting out of hand really quickly with the tokens Edgar generates. As you all know, the most important part of every deck are the interaction spells. Personally, I play a ton of them. First up, we have Thought to Exile. Solid 1 mana removal spell, hard to beat in efficiency. We also play Swords to Plowshares. 1 mana, get to remove any creature. One of the stronger uncommon cards ever printed in our opinion is Boros Charm. It has 3 options, which are all solid in itself. We can deal 4 damage to a target player or planeswalker, which can close out a game. We can give a creature double strike, which can also surprisingly close out a game. Most important part in this deck is the second ability, giving all of our creatures indestructible until the end of turn. As you can imagine, the biggest enemy of this creature-based deck are board wipes. Boros Charm can really turn the tide of battle. Most controversial card in the deck is the Meathook Massacre. I know it's really weird to play a board wipe in a creature-based deck, but hear me out. You can also cast it with X being 0. When it's on the battlefield, it's an awesome draining enchantment that's a perfect fit for the deck. We don't even have to pay for the X cost. That being said, if you're behind on the board, which usually will not happen, but if it happens, you get to reset the board with Meathook Massacre. In our opinion, you should always play this in an Edgar deck. With all the tokens you generate and your board being filled, you can sometimes even win games by casting this and wiping your own board, draining opponents and lethaling them. And have you seen the awesome movie poster reprint it's getting in Innistrad Remastered? Let us know in the comment which you like most, the classic art or the new one. Anguished Unmaking, for 3 mana, we get to remove any non-land permanent from the game. Solid spot removal, good inclusion. In our opinion, the cards that benefit from controlling your commander or not are really busted. That being said, we have to play Akiroma's Will in this deck. It's just too good. The first ability buffs all your creatures and allows you to close out games when you swing sideways with your vampires. Second ability grants protection to all your creatures by granting them indestructible. If you control Edgar on the field, which is when you will be swinging anyways, because you will have a lot of vampires as well, this card is crazy since you can choose both options. Auto-include. You know what's even better than granting indestructible to your creatures? It's phasing them out, since no one can interact with them. Not even a Toxic Deluge will clear them. We have Clever Concealment for 4 mana. We can phase out any creatures we like. It also has Convoke, so we can tap 4 creatures, and we can basically phase out any creatures for 0 mana. Really solid card. Convoking will not be a problem, since we will have a ton of vampires. Now we are on the topic of Convoke spells. We also have Lethal Scheme. There's a 4 cost that destroys any target creature, but you can also convoke creatures to pay for the mana cost. So basically it says 0 mana, remove any creature. You can just tap your vampires. We don't play board wipes in this deck because it would go against our own strategy. That being said, we do play a ton of one-sided board wipes, meaning that we only clear the opponent's board. Olivia's Rat gives every non-vampire creature -X/-X, where X is the amount of vampires we control. Really solid card, will clear the entire board most of the time, except for your vampires. We also play Ruinous Ultimatum. Another controversial card in the list, not many other people will play, but in my opinion, it's really good. For 7 mana, really specific to colors, you get to remove every non-land permanent you do not control. The ultimate one-sided board wipe. It's a really solid card, and later in the game, if you cast it at the right time, you will just win outright. The most unique card in this deck is Everything Comes to Dust. It's a board wipe with Convoke, so we can cast it really early on in the game most of the time. There's the added benefit of not exiling creatures of the chosen type that have been used to actually convoke the spell. So if we use a vampire to pay for the convoke cost, it will not exile vampires, acting as another one-sided board wipe. Really awesome card. Moving on to the utility lands. First up, Castle Locthwain. It basically replaces a swamp and it allows us to draw cards later on in the game. As mentioned before, our hand will be empty really fast in this deck. For the same reason, we play Minas Tirith, another awesome land that will draw us cards. We'll usually enter untapped anyways. Must-have card for any tribal deck is Cavern of Souls, basically allowing you to generate mana of any color to cast a chosen creature type and making them uncounterable. That being said, I'm actually on the verge of cutting this one since we play so many specific mana color symbols on our spells, and Cavern only grants colorless for non-vampire spells. So we will have to test this one out and see how it turns out. Auto-inclusion, any Edgar deck is Phyrexian Tower. Generates 1 colorless mana, or we get to sacrifice a creature and generate 2 black mana. Whenever we play a vampire, we get another token instead, which we can sacrifice. And sacrificing stuff will most of the time cause you to drain the table. Awesome inclusion. We also play 2 of the Horizon lands for 2 reasons. First up, they generate 2 colors for the cost of 1 life, which doesn't really matter anyways. We will have enough life throughout the game anyways because of our drain spells. Later on in the game, we get to sacrifice them to actually draw cards, which is awesome for this deck. One of my personal favorite cards is Takenuma. It's a land that generates 1 black mana, doesn't enter tapped ever, and has a channel ability to recur your creatures from your graveyard. It's really good in grindy games. As longer as the game goes on, the more value this will generate. Also keep in mind, a channel ability is something you cannot interact with, so opponents can't counter this. A card that everyone was really hyped about when it got first spoiled is 3/3 City from Bloomburrow. We can choose a creature type when it enters, vampires. We can pay 2 mana, tap it, and we generate mana equal to the amount of vampires we control. I still have to test this card out. It might seem good on paper, but we don't have that many outs for a ton of mana. So we will have to see how it plays out. Urborg, auto-inclusion in a 3-color deck that runs black, just fixes our mana, allows us to tap any land for black mana, perfect. We replaced 1 swamp with Agadim's Awakening. Usually we just play this as a land, but later on in the game, again in grindy games, we can put a lot of mana into X and just put our graveyard onto the table again. Perfect to recover from some board wipes you will undoubtedly face. The only vampire tribal land that exists is Voldaren Estate. Generates mana. If you pay life, we generate any color to cast a vampire spell, and later on in the game, we get to generate blood tokens. It's not an auto-inclusion in a vampire deck, but it's a really solid card, especially later in the game, really focusing on the grind later in the game and drawing cards with the blood tokens. Before we talk about the combo in the deck, we'll talk about the regular lands. Keep in mind, I chose a more expensive land base, you can make it cheaper, but in our opinion, Edgar will not function on a cheaper land base. He's really specific in the colors he needs. You play an early game deck, so you do need the colors as early as possible. That being said, if you don't really care about the power level of your deck and you're not that competitive, you can downgrade the cost of this deck by just playing more basics. Or even some guild gates. My favorite land type, fetch lands, we play 3 of them. Allows us to get the shock lands, the triome, our basic lands, really filters our deck. Awesome cards. Bit more on the expensive side though. If you want to invest in a land base, in my opinion, you should also get all shock lands. We play 3 of them. Shock lands are just really solid, giving you the option to enter tapped or enter untapped for the cost of 2 life. They also have basic land types, so you are able to fetch them with fetch lands. We play 3 pain lands. These are basically the lands that allow you to tap them for 1 of 2 colors for the cost of 1 life. We play 3 check lands, which will check if you have a basic land type in play of that type. If you do, they enter untapped, otherwise they enter tapped, and they tap for 1 of 2 colors. We also play all 3 lands that will check if you have 2 or more opponents. If you do, they will enter untapped. I don't know what this land type is called. Let us know in the comments below. I don't know. We play 1 Mana Confluence, a land that generates 1 mana of any color for the cost of 1 life. Solid addition in the deck. As mentioned before, Edgar has some really color intensive cards and we really need the correct symbols early in the game. And last but not least, we play Command Tower. Auto-inclusion in any commander deck. Best land there is for the deck. 2 mountains, 2 plains, 3 swamps. So I've been talking about the combo in this deck a lot. You actually only play 1 sort of combo, and I will not make it any more complicated than it is. You will need to have Marauding Blightpriest or Vito on the battlefield. What they will do is, whenever you gain life, each opponent will lose 1 life. The other part of the combo we need is one of these 2 cards on the battlefield. Bloodthirsty Conqueror or Exquisite Blood. What they will do is, whenever an opponent loses life, we will gain life. Yeah, you know the combo already. So the first 2 options will deal damage whenever you gain life. The second 2 options will gain you life whenever you deal damage. So you just need 1 point of damage or life gain and you will start an infinite cycle draining out your opponents entirely. One of the most classic and easy combos Magic has ever had. So that's it for the video. We're really excited about Innistrad Remastered releasing soon on January 27th. Really hoping to pull some movie poster cards, especially serialized Edgar. Any recommendations, any questions, leave them in the comments below, or you can always join our Discord server. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, hit the bell icon so you actually get notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.